The bunker smelled of cedar and cold ambition. 40 meters below the port district of Incheon, behind 3 reinforced steel doors and a biometric scanner that didn't log foreign faces, Chairman Kang Byung-soo had built himself a room that the world couldn't see into. He liked rooms like that. He'd built his entire empire on the principle that the most dangerous conversations were the ones that left no echo. The walls were pale granite, smooth as a lie told often enough to believe. A single lacquered conference table dominated the center, black as a funeral suit, long enough to seat 12, currently seating 8. The lighting overhead was the kind of clinical white that erased shadows and made everyone look slightly guilty, which Kang found useful. Overhead cameras, 4 of them, blinked their red eyes at intervals. His cameras, his eyes, his room. He was 71 years old, and he wore it the way a blade wears age, not dulled, but honed. Silver-haired, immaculate in a charcoal suit that cost more than most Koreans earned in a year. He sat at the head of the table with the practiced stillness of a man who had learned long ago that movement was a form of weakness. His hands rested flat on the table. His expression communicated nothing. His eyes communicated everything. Small, dark, permanently calculating, like 2 chips of obsidian dropped into a face that had forgotten how to apologize. Across from him, the South African delegation arranged themselves with the careful dignity of men who understood they were guests in a hostile house. 4 of them, mine executives mostly, the kind of men who spent their lives in the dark, underground, watching other people pull wealth from the earth. Their lead negotiator, a broad-shouldered man named Dlamani, had the deep, unhurried voice of someone accustomed to being heard. He smiled across the table with the practiced warmth of international commerce, wide, white, reaching nowhere near his eyes. No one in this room fully trusted anyone else, but isn't that how every great deal begins? The meeting had been billed as a partnership summit. Kang's Sang-Hoa Industrial Group was offering to supply mining equipment to 3 of South Africa's largest platinum operations. A generous contract, favorable terms, machinery that would, on paper, modernize an aging infrastructure and deliver 30% efficiency gains. The South Africans had flown 14 hours for this. They didn't know what was already waiting for them at the bottom of those mines. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Kang spoke to his aide without looking up from the folder of documents spread before him. His voice was flat, transactional, the way a man orders furniture. "Bring the girl in." The service door, smaller, tucked behind a panel of granite facing, opened without ceremony, and Amara walked in. She was 26 years old, Afro-Korean with her mother's deep brown skin and her father's sharp sole cheekbones, a combination that produced a face of striking, quiet beauty that she had long since learned to make invisible. She wore gray cleaning clothes 2 sizes too large, her natural hair pressed beneath a pale cotton cap, her eyes cast down with the deliberate vacancy of someone who had been taught, by circumstances, not by nature, that invisibility was a form of survival. She carried a steel bucket, a wide-bristled scrub brush, and a second, unmarked canister of solution attached to a strap across her shoulder. She crossed the room without acknowledgement, knelt at the far edge of the floor, and began to scrub. Kang watched her settle into position. Then he turned to the South African delegation, and something shifted in his face. Not warmth exactly, but its theatrical imitation. "Forgive the interruption," he said in English, his accent precise and clipped. "The floor is being maintained. Please do not concern yourself." He paused. Let the image settle. A black woman on her knees scrubbing the floor while black men sat at his table, made to negotiate with him. The choreography of it was intentional. The message was fluent, even without words. "I decide what your people do here." Dlamani's jaw tightened. Barely, just a millimeter of tension in the muscle below his ear, but it was there. He looked once at the woman on the floor, then back at Kang, and he smiled the way you smile when you are in someone else's country and their security detail has weapons and you do not. Amara scrubbed. She did not look up. The meeting resumed. For the first 20 minutes, it was standard. Technical specifications, delivery timelines, warranty agreements. The kind of language that accountants dream about and human beings endure. But Kang's attention began to shift. He glanced, occasionally, toward the delegation, specifically at their suit pockets, at the slight rectangular outlines of translation devices two of them carried. Technology he recognized, technology he had already assessed in advance as incapable of processing archaic dialect. His aide caught the chairman's eye. A small nod passed between them. Kang leaned back, and then the first fracture in the polished surface of the meeting appeared. He began to speak to his aide, casually, almost lazily, as if thinking aloud, in a dialect so obscure it had not been spoken outside of certain Joseon-era aristocratic families in over 3 generations. Not modern Korean, not the clean consumer Korean of Seoul's glass towers. This was Gwijok Mal, the court tongue of an older hierarchy, dense with grammatical inversions and vocabulary that didn't appear in any standard dictionary. Scholars had written papers about it. Almost no one alive spoke it fluently. The translation devices in the South Africans' pockets registered only static. Kang smiled and began to speak freely. Droba, he murmured to his aide, listen. These men flew here from the other end of the earth, and they still don't know what's already in the shipment. He chuckled, low and private, like a man sharing a punchline only he could hear. The calibration defects are already built into the drill arrays, pressure sensors that will underread by 30% under sustained load. In 6 months, maybe 8, he tilted his head, almost playfully, those mines will be experiencing catastrophic shaft failures. Not enough to kill quickly, enough to bleed them, enough that they'll need us again for the repairs. He tapped the table with one finger. They'll never stop needing us. His aide allowed himself a brief smile, schooled quickly back to neutral. Kang leaned forward and, in English, said warmly to Dlamani, we are very pleased to formalize this partnership. My legal team will have the contract addendum ready by Thursday. Dlamani extended his hand across the table. We look forward to it. Clueless, thought Kang, and shook the hand with both of his. On the floor, 12 feet away, Amara scrubbed. Her brush moved in slow, methodical circles across the pale stone. The gray water in her bucket foamed slightly. The unmarked canister at her hip had been open for the last 9 minutes. She had not looked up once. The minutes passed. The meeting rolled forward through its careful theater. Questions about logistics, about tariff structures, about after-sales service agreements. Kang performed hospitality with the ease of a man who had performed it 10,000 times. He offered tea. He offered statistics. He offered the delegation a verbal tour of his manufacturing facilities, each detail selected to impress and to obscure. But underneath the table, beneath the surface of every polished sentence, the real meeting was still running, the one being conducted in a dead dialect in the spaces between Kang's English pleasantries. He spoke to his aide in fragments, asides, observations about the South Africans that would have curdled the air if translated. That one, the big one with the gold watch, he's the decision maker. The others are decoration. A pause. Make sure the demonstration models they inspect next week are the clean units, not the production batch. His aide nodded. And the woman, Kang's eyes moved briefly to Amara. Make sure she finishes before the cameras come on for the formal signing. I don't want her in the frame. He said it without malice, without anger, with the flat administrative certainty of a man who had never needed to feel anything about people who were beneath his notice. That, in its own way, was more brutal than hatred. Amara's brush stopped moving, just for a fraction of a second. Then it resumed. But her shoulders had changed. The slight, deliberate curve of invisibility she'd held for the past 30 minutes, gone. Something had straightened, almost imperceptibly in her spine. If you weren't watching closely, you would have missed it completely. Glamini was watching. He didn't know why. He looked at the cleaning woman on the floor, and something in his chest constricted without his permission, a sympathetic unease he couldn't name and didn't have time to examine. He looked back at Kang. The chairman was already somewhere else entirely. 40 minutes in, and Kang was comfortable in the way that dangerous men get comfortable, expanded, voluminous, taking up more of the room. He had loosened slightly in his chair. His aide had refilled his tea twice. The South Africans were relaxed, or performing relaxation convincingly, which amounts to the same thing in a room like this. He had begun, gradually, to say more than was necessary. That was his only flaw. Not greed, not cruelty. Those he managed with perfect discipline. His flaw was audience. He needed, occasionally, to be witnessed. He needed someone in the room to know the full architecture of what he had built. And since he couldn't tell the South Africans, and his aides heard it too often to appreciate it, he had begun to narrate it to himself, in that dead dialect, with the slow pleasure of a man reading his own legend aloud. 40 years, he said quietly, almost meditatively, to no one in particular. 40 years I have been building this. People think it began with the Busan contract. It didn't. He swirled his tea. It began with a woman who trusted me. His aide glanced at him. There was something careful in the glance. Careful in the way you watch a fire that's been burning well but has just shifted wind. Kang continued. His voice dropped low, the archaic syllables falling from his mouth like water over old stones. She had the connections, the access to the ministry files, the relationships I needed. I was a slight pause, and in that pause lived something that might, in another man, have been regret. 29 years old, and I had nothing but ambition and a willingness to do what others wouldn't. He set down his cup. I used what she gave me, and then I made sure she couldn't take it back. The aide was very still. Her daughter tried to find the records once, years ago. He dismissed it with a wave of his hand. Nothing came of it. He looked up, almost surprised to find himself in the room, and redirected his attention to the South Africans with a smooth, practiced smile. Shall we discuss the payment structure? On the floor, 12 feet away, Amara's hand had stopped moving entirely. The brush rested on the stone. The water had spread in a thin, glassy sheet across a wide section of the floor, perhaps 4 meters by 3, beneath the table and around the legs of the South Africans' chairs. A section of floor that the hidden cameras mounted inside the South Africans' translation devices, the ones that Kang had dismissed as standard translation technology, were aimed directly down at. Her head was still bowed, but her eyes were open, and they were dry. The room didn't change all at once. The shift was slow, the way light changes before a storm. Not darkness exactly, but a quality of attention, a heaviness that hadn't been there before. Glamini felt it first. He shifted in his chair, glanced down, and frowned. The floor beneath the table was wet, but it wasn't cloudy the way cleaning water would be. It was almost perfectly clear, and there was something beneath the surface of it, something that the light, striking it at a low angle, was beginning to make visible. Lines, columns, figures, numbers. He bent forward slightly, his brow creasing, and what he saw made his throat go absolutely dry. The floor was a document, or rather, the floor had become a document. The solution Amara had been applying for the past 45 minutes was not cleaning fluid. It was a photographic developer, a modified chemical compound she had spent 3 months calibrating, and the floor itself had been pre-treated 2 nights ago during a cleaning shift that no one had found unusual, with photosensitive chemicals that responded to this developer the way old film responds to light. The image was emerging now, slow and deliberate as a confession. column after column of financial records, account numbers, transfer dates, shell company names, the meticulously documented evidence of 40 years of bribery, fraud, and deliberate corporate sabotage. Chairman Kang Bang-won-soo's private ledgers, which had been photographed by a woman named Park Soo-yeon, who trusted him once, and who kept copies because she was smarter than he knew, and who gave them before she died to the only person she trusted them with, her granddaughter. The South Africans were staring. Their translation devices, which were in fact something rather more than translation devices, were recording every line, every number, every timestamp. The room held its breath. And then Amara stood up. She rose the way old buildings don't fall, not dramatically, not with flair, but with the slow, irreducible weight of something that had been standing a long time before anyone noticed it. She straightened to her full height. She removed the cotton cap from her head, and her natural hair released itself into the cold air of the bunker. She looked at Chairman Kang Byung-soo across the width of his own lacquered table, and then she spoke to him, in Gui-jokmal, perfectly, fluidly, with a grammatical precision that would have impressed a linguist and quietly destroyed a proud man. And in the second sentence, she did something that made the aide flinch visibly. She corrected a construction Kang had used earlier in the meeting, a subtle error, the kind that only a native-level speaker would catch. She corrected it gently, almost clinically, the way a surgeon makes an incision, not with anger, but with the absolute confidence of someone who has been waiting for the right moment for a very long time. Kang went still. Not the practiced stillness of a man in control, the genuine stillness of a man whose understanding of a room has just collapsed entirely. His eyes moved across her face, looking, rapidly, for the architecture of someone he recognized, finding something, finding a jawline, a set of the brow, a way of holding eye contact that triggered a memory he had spent decades covering over. "You," he said, and stopped, and said in Korean, his voice stripped of its veneer for the first time, "Who are you?" Amara answered him, not loudly. She didn't need to be loud. "My name is Amara Osei Park." She let that settle. "My grandmother was Park Soo-yeon. She was 27 years old when she gave you everything she had. The ministry contacts, the internal audits, the access codes to files that were never meant to leave that building." She paused. "You used all of it, and then you filed a police report that named her as the leak." The room was absolutely silent. "My grandmother spent 4 years in prison." Amara's voice did not waver. It was not the voice of someone performing grief. It was the voice of someone who had already moved through grief and come out somewhere harder on the other side. Kang had drawn his hands, which had been flat on the table, into fists. He was very pale. "Before she died, my grandmother gave my mother a box. Inside the box were copies of everything: the transfers, the shell accounts, the minutes of meetings that officially never happened, photographs of documents that officially no longer exist." She glanced down at the floor, at the luminous grid of numbers spreading beneath the South Africans' chairs, their cameras drinking it in, and then she looked at him. She kept them on film, old-fashioned silver halide film. She always said that digital evidence could be deleted. A beat. She trusted chemistry more than computers. One of the South African delegates had lowered himself very slightly in his chair to look at the floor. He said nothing. He simply looked, and then looked at the camera in his cufflink and nodded once. "I have been working in your buildings for 3 years, in the Busan office, in the Seoul Tower, and in this bunker which I entered for the first time 18 months ago as a maintenance contractor, and have entered 11 times since." She looked at him steadily. "The floor you are sitting in was treated on Tuesday night. The developing agent I have been applying goes to work in approximately 50 minutes. You scheduled this meeting for 2 hours. She tilted her head very slightly. "You like precision. I thought you'd appreciate that." Kang was on his feet. His chair scraped backward, loud as a gunshot in the silence. "You," he said, and stopped. and said, in Korean, his voice stripped of its veneer for the first time, "Who are you?" It was raw now, exposed, the voice of a man who has lived his whole life in fortified rooms and is suddenly standing in open air. "Do you understand what you've done? Do you understand who I am? I will—" "You will what?" Her voice was quiet, quieter than his. That quiet was devastating. "Call security? Your security team leader has been receiving copies of these records by encrypted message for the last 40 minutes. He's currently deciding whether his loyalty to you is worth a 15-year prison sentence." She paused. "I'm told he's a practical man." The aide had not moved. He was staring at Amara with an expression that was equal parts terror and something that, in another context, might have looked like relief, the particular expression of a man who has been complicit in something for too long and has just been handed a reason to stop. Delamy rose from his chair slowly. He looked at the floor, at the glowing document spread beneath his feet, a ghost map of 40 years of crime rendered in light and chemistry on pale Korean stone. And then he looked at Amara. "This is admissible?" he asked quietly. "The floor is a photographic print," she said. "Legally, it is documentary evidence. The developing process is on record. The chain of custody of the original film is documented and notarized." She reached into the pocket of her gray cleaning clothes and removed a small drive. She set it on the table without ceremony. "This contains the digital scans. Your legal team will be receiving a certified copy in approximately," she glanced at her watch, "4 minutes." Delamy looked at the drive, looked at Kang. "I believe," he said with the measured gravity of a man accustomed to delivering verdicts, "this meeting is concluded." Kang Byung-soo did not speak again for a long time. He stood at the head of his table in his room 40 meters below the earth, in the place he had chosen specifically because it left no echo, no record, no trace. He stood in a room that had been a trap built over 3 years by a woman half his age, executed with a patience and a precision that mirrored, almost surgically, his own. He was still holding his teacup. He became aware of it and set it down very carefully, as if extreme precision of movement might restore some order to the world. It didn't. He looked at the floor, at the numbers spreading there in their quiet chemical light. His numbers, his accounts, his history, rendered visible by the very stone he'd chosen to walk on. There is a specific variety of defeat that only comes to men who have never imagined it. Not just the practical defeat, the arrests that would follow, the asset freezes, the trials, but the conceptual collapse. The moment when the story you have been telling yourself about who you are simply ceases to be available. When the architecture of your self-perception, assembled stone by stone over decades, is revealed to have been built on ground that belonged to someone else all along. Kang Byung-soo stood in that moment, and Amara let him stand in it. She did not look away. She did not grant him the mercy of her absence. She stood with her bucket and her brush and her unmarked canister, and she looked at him the way her grandmother had probably looked at him in that first moment of betrayal, with full recognition, without flinching, except that her grandmother had not known what was coming, and Amara had chosen it entirely. When she finally spoke, her voice was not triumphant. Triumph would have cheapened it. What she felt was not satisfaction. It was something older and quieter than that. The specific piece of a thing completed. A debt not repaid, but witnessed, acknowledged at last by the world. "You thought I was cleaning your floor," she said. She looked at him. "I was erasing your future." She walked out the way she had walked in, through the service door, with the bucket, with the brush, with the empty canister. She did not run. She did not look back. In the corridor beyond the steel door, she stopped, leaned against the granite wall, pressed both palms flat against the cold stone, and breathed. Once, twice, A third time, the uncontrolled, ragged breath of someone who has been holding themselves together from the inside for a very long time. She thought of her grandmother, not the version of her grandmother she knew from photographs, formal, careful, wearing the expression of a woman surviving, but the version she had assembled over years of listening to her mother's stories. Young and brilliant at 27, working in the Ministry of Trade with a sharpness and a drive that had made men twice her age uncomfortable in ways they couldn't articulate, trusting one of them anyway, paying for it in years. Amara had asked her mother once whether she was angry. Her mother had been quiet for a long time before she answered. Anger is a fire. A fire needs feeding. I didn't have the energy to feed it. I had a daughter to raise. She'd looked at Amara with an expression too complex to name. But chemistry, and here she'd smiled, small and private, her own mother's smile transplanted into a new face. Chemistry just waits. Amara straightened, picked up her bucket. In the room behind her, she could hear, muffled by granite and steel, the sound of a phone call being made. Then another. Then what sounded like the beginning of several very difficult conversations happening at once. She walked down the corridor toward the service elevator. The overhead light was fluorescent, functional, the color of facts. It caught the sheen of moisture on the stone floor where she'd walked, the faint evaporating trace of a solution that had already finished its work. In 48 hours, Kang Byung-soo's assets would be frozen across 4 jurisdictions. In 60, the first arrest warrant would be issued. In 3 months, the South African mines would commission an independent audit of the equipment shipment. Every defective component would be found, every calibration error would be documented, and the names of the engineers who had built those errors in deliberately, each one recorded in the ledgers now permanently etched into the floor of a high-security bunker in Incheon, would enter the public record. The full ledger would eventually occupy 1,100 pages of court documentation. It began on a floor. There is a Korean proverb, old enough that even scholars disagree about its origin, "Badagi marenda," the floor speaks. It refers usually to the idea that the lowest surfaces of a place, the ground we walk on, the earth beneath structures, hold truths that walls and ceilings conceal, that what is stepped on does not disappear, that pressure, over time, produces not silence but impression. Chairman Kang had lived his entire life above the ground, in towers, in bunkers, in rooms elevated above consequence. He had built those rooms with other people's stone, other people's trust, other people's ruin, and he had believed with the absolute confidence of a man who has never been contradicted that the ground was his. He had never considered that it might be watching. That night, in a small apartment in the Yeonsu district, Amara sat at her kitchen table with a cup of tea she wasn't drinking and a photograph she'd been carrying for 3 years. It was old, printed on paper that had gone slightly amber with age. A woman in her late 20s, standing in front of a government building in Seoul, squinting into summer light with a smile that had not yet learned to be careful. Park Soo-yeon, her grandmother, 40 years gone from that smile, into a silence no one had been able to break. Until today. Amara placed her palm flat over the photograph, held it there. Outside, the port lights of Incheon blinked across the water in their indifferent rhythm, red and white, like a slow, mechanical pulse. She thought, it is done. Not the way things are done in stories, complete, sealed, finished, more the way chemistry is done, the reaction completed, the compound stabilized, the process arrived at its end not with drama, but with the quiet finality of a substance becoming what it was always going to become under the right conditions. She had been the right conditions. She drank her tea. The floor of the bunker in Incheon was still glowing, 40 meters below the port. The lights had been left on when the security detail escorted everyone out. The chemicals would hold the image for approximately 72 hours before fading, more than enough time for the documentation teams arriving in the morning. For now, in an empty room with no one left to see it, the floor held its record of everything that had been done in the dark and never answered for, spread across pale stone like a map of a country that believed itself invisible, rendered finally, irrevocably, into the light. The floor you walk on, the old proverb says, it remembers.